No, because you had a tremendous image in France. Your image in France was tremendous.
In the beginning.
You were the most famous man in France. In the 70s.
Yes.
But also, what is interesting, that I was also very successful in Italy. Casiraghi, and a lot of... So there was something between critics, Italian critics and French critics, who I discovered loved my films for different reasons. And then critics actually in other countries too were good, but they were not always loving the films for the same reason. Therefore, I discovered that actually I had this kind of, what I was doing was not necessarily...
Bojana disagrees.
Yeah, what?
You're constantly talking about your first two films. Since Cahiers changed, you were just mentioned once.
Yeah, they quite hated me, yeah. When they moved to Maoist period, when they dropped pictures.
Yeah.
No.
Thank you for remembering.
Yeah, no, I remember old Cahiers.
You see it here, sitting in front of you, who has no one...
Gentleman is from Cahiers?
No, maybe he looks
But
like...
do you have pictures, or you still don't have pictures?
I'm not from Cahiers. Please, don't insult me. Please.
I was really shocked when Cahiers dropped the pictures. You remember there was this period when they...
Yes, it became a Maoist journal. It became a Maoist journal.
Maoist.
Yeah.
Maoists.
Yeah. But American critics are also... Yeah, thank you for Asian critics.
There's a question from the front row.
Yes, I wonder how much have you followed up with, after your psychology studies, with psychological literature or philosophy, even or film theory? Is this something you've been reading while doing, your first, second, third, and then later films? And what was very influential to you? Was it like Freud or more Lacan, for example? It's something that interests me.
No, it's more Eisenstein, Pudovkin in Russian cinema. And actually, at some point, my dream was to do a doctorate on Russian avant-garde. But then I was thrown out of, I was thrown out of Belgrade. So all this academic development stopped at a certain point. I could not live in the town. But so it was more, I think that I learned more psychology. I continued with my studies of Russian editing, but not necessarily Freud. It was more, I discovered probably Reich more, Freud was a little boring, and Reich was strange. And especially when I discovered that they burned all his books. So when we got a chance to live, we lived in the States in 1969, we got, 9 months to live in the States, it was communication studies. So it was basically, I was treated as somebody who was doing journalism as a student, and for the grant was for me to visit film studios and TV stations, and of course we used it just to go to see underground movies and meet some interesting people. And Reich very quickly became a center of my next film. It became because we started meeting people who were connected with Reich, and I was unaware, at the time when I read about Reich, I was unaware that he was put in prison. I was unaware that they burned all his books. And when we came there in America, even a lot of people who were connected with Reich, they didn't speak to each other. They were frightened. Some of them died. Some of them committed suicide, people who were with Reich, because Reich died in prison as outcast. But then when I discovered that probably there is a movie, we started digging more. And the greatest thing that I liked was to shoot the place when all his books were burned. It was in a big incinerator in the south of New York. But what I didn't know, even in the film, you can see the place where the books were burned. And there is a voice saying, here, all Reich's books are burned. And my idea was that they collected probably, I don't know, 1 truck of books or something. They were I think, it was several tons of his books. The American government burned all Reich's books that had nothing to do with Oregon, nothing to do with, it was some kind of government revenge. It's unbelievable what happened to the man. So when we traveled around and then we met the family, etc., then that's how WR got developed through our trip around. But basically it started from my grant for journalistic grant, not psychological. But it got connected.
There's a question.
Yes, you mentioned Russian avant-garde, Eisenstein, Ziegler-Werther and so on.
Now we can hear you.
You mentioned Russian avant-garde, Eisenstein, Ziegler-Werther and so on, but you also used many times Ciaureli. Can you explain that connection? Is it only because some similarities to Leni Riefenstahl, or what is the real connection to Ciaureli?
The real connection is that I've seen all these films from my age of 12. That was the most important Russian films from the period. And for several years after the liberation in 1944, we were just watching American films. No, there were no American films. There were only Russian films. So we've seen all these films as school children. We were taking in the school to see these films. And they were like kind of great films, but like all Alexandrov films. They were funny because they became very popular Stalinist films. But later, when I discovered that Alexandrov, as the assistant of Eisenstein, that he was the one who was jumping in the Potemkin. You know, these guys who were officers thrown in the water from the boat. It was Alexandrov was one of the acrobats.
By saving Vakulinchuk.
Excuse me?
By saving Vakulinchuk, that's it.
Yes, yeah. So all this but then Cinematheque was like full of Russian movies. Later we managed to get all these Russian movies that were not easy to find. And later I was lucky even to see the first package that came of Russian films after the perestroika and how to you call it, friendship with America and Russia. I was invited to a great first meeting of collective of American people who were running cinematheques and critics, and Russian guys who were teaching film and running cinematheque. It was an unbelievable meeting in America in 1969 or 70 or 70, some 71, I don't know, one of these years. And I was invited by Americans, and I was the only non-American, non-Russian. But Americans asked Russians, would they like to see me at this meeting? And they said, oh yes, Russian critics and Russian guys from cinematheques. So I was the only one there, and what happened, it was like 3 days, big meeting, translation, and after the second day, the misunderstanding between Americans and Russians, and they were all people who loved movies, and they were movie people. But misunderstanding was so horrible that Russians were ready to pack and go, because whatever Russians said, the translators were translating it directly. So the Russians would start the speech, say, as you know well, the film art is the most important art of all arts. So the translator would translate it directly. But it was like Lenin's or Stalin's words, you know. So when Russian would say, the film art is most important art, he was joking against bureaucracy. And it was almost like saying, fuck Lenin and Stalin. So Russians would start ironically, because the irony was the main way how you could speak politically in Russia. There was no direct political speak in Russia. And I remember when we traveled first time in Russia, they all speak through poetry, they speak through Mayakovsky, they quote Dostoevsky. That was the way to speak politically in Russia. And you quote something and everybody knows that it relates to something else. So this meeting between Americans and Russians was absolutely disaster. And then I was like forced to translate to them. Russians came with the big lists. They wanted to exchange 1,000 Russian students, to send 1,000 Russian students to all film schools in America to learn how to make movies American way. And they would give 1,000 grants, stipends, to American students to come to study in Russia whatever they want. And for Americans it was something unimaginable, because there were like Americans there who would say, we can get maybe 2 students. You know, in America, each university can give 1 or 2 grants. in America nobody thinks about the nation. Well, in America it has no nation, it's just kind of, it's me. Government is something else. But this was magic, strange magic, that I helped a little and it stayed. They managed to go to the third day. But Russians went back very unhappy. So I had this kind of advantage to understand the Russians when they speak, when they make movies. And in Russian movies, very often you would have symbolic things. When the guy from the kolkhoz is dead, and they carry him through the the sunflowers. You know, this was a Bolshevik killed by kulaks, and they carried that Bolshevik through the sunflowers. And then, so all this kind of imagery that, but the old guy in the village who wants to die, because he can't stand life probably, he sits on the pile of apples. So he eats one apple. He says, I'm hungry. And he eats an apple, and he says, and I want to die. Then he eats one apple, and he dies. This is one of these fantastic Russian movies from 20s. But when you watch it now, you will understand that actually this sequence was shot at a time when about several million Ukrainians died of hunger, because there was this big Stalin cleaning of individual property in Ukraine. And there were literally millions, several million Ukrainians died. And that was the time when Dovzhenko made a film about this peasant who wants to die, who eats an apple, and he dies. And I've seen this film again a few days ago, and it was unbelievable. When you understand historically what this meant to be shown in Moscow, probably everybody in Moscow knew that this film is about what Bolsheviks did to Ukrainians. But it was like a strange language they used.
So much about you being influenced by Soviet cinema. Any other questions? There is one in the second row.